Awesome. So my name's Ryan. This is High Carb Regenerator. Today I have Georgie with me. Georgie, I don't know if he's a sugar expert, but he definitely knows a whole lot about sugar. And I just wanted to, pummel him with questions basically. And thanks for being on the channel.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I know about sugar, but I eat it every day in profuse amounts, in copious amounts. So yeah. Maybe hopefully I can share something.
Before I really get started with the questions, now I see your name coming up with Ray Peat quite a bit. Did you have a connection with Ray Peat?
I mean, I thought we had like a semi-cordial relationship, and I've been communicating with him throughout the years. I probably didn't send him that many emails directly, maybe 10 total since I found him in around circa 2011, his work. But we did a number of podcasts with Danny, Roddy, and Ray. And that's when I got to interact with him more directly. Other than that, I've basically been reading his work and applying it to my own journey and basically experimenting with various pro-metabolic ideas that he's been writing about for the last couple of decades. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I'm not a formal teacher of his. I'm more like a follower that he probably didn't even know about for a long time. Yeah. And then we just interacted over Danny's podcast and exchanged a few emails. That's it.
And people are going to want to know. So you're basically like a researcher. Somebody said I seen a couple of times that you're like an IT guy that does research at night, basically.
Well, yes, but a bit of a background. When I graduated with an IT degree, computer science degree, back in 2002, it was right after the dot-com crash, and nobody wanted to touch people with my degree with a 10-foot pole. Yeah. So I had to find some kind of a job, and the only job was as a programmer at a biochemical outfit called the National Biomedical Research Foundation, NBRF. And they were basically, creating these databases of protein sequences and implementing various algorithms to do fuzzy matching. So it was an IT job, but the subject matter experts, subject matter experts were 40 to 50 pretty famous, high-profile biochemists, doctors, neurologists, geneticists, etc. So that's, I worked with them for about 3 years, and that's how I kind of picked up the lingo. And after that, so that was between 2000 and 2005. And after that, it's been mostly a hobby of mine. So it wasn't just like, suddenly I decided to do that. But basically I was kind of, inadvertently forced into it through my desperate attempts to find work back in 2002. And since then it grew out into a bigger hobby, and I started doing my own research. I'm now conducting my own animal experiments through a licensed lab, and that's pretty much it. But my day job is still in IT. I mean, I'm a government contractor, and that's what pays the bills.
That's crazy. Do you know who Nathan Pritikin is?
He may be posting on the forum, the Repeat forum.
No,
where I'm.
No. He's dead now. But you and him have a similar story. Only his started back in World War II.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think the main question that I really had was, what causes insulin resistance in your opinion?
High amounts of fat and also elevated cortisol. And by the way, these two go hand in hand, especially if you eat the polyunsaturated fats, which are highly pro-inflammatory, right? So they generate a lot of inflammatory mediators. And one of the responses of the organism to this inflammatory cascade is, of course, to raise cortisol. In addition, most of the fats, but especially the polyunsaturated fats, can actually block the insulin at the receptor level. So it's basically preventing insulin from doing its work. And this leads to increased insulin release, often seen on blood tests. And since due to the so-called Rendell cycle, the fatty acids prevent the proper oxidation of sugar, then you have the sugar floating around, resulting in hyperglycemia, which is also seen on blood tests, right? And if sugar cannot be properly metabolized, it gets converted mostly into lactic acid or even more fat, as triglycerides. So it's just this vicious cycle. But I think the way it starts with initially is basically through consumption of highly pro-inflammatory fats and or a combination with a stressful lifestyle. The worst possible thing is both, and a combination of both. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the Western world, that's their daily existence. They're eating commercial food, mostly prepared with PUFA. And of course, I wouldn't surprise anybody if I tell you that most people's lives these days in the Western world are pretty stressful.
Yeah.
So over time, this leads to basically you can't process these calories. They build up, right, leading to more insulin resistance, more insulin release, more cortisol release due to the inflammation. Cortisol also blocks the effects of insulin. It blocks the uptake of sugar into the cell as well. It suppresses thyroid function, suppresses gonadal function. So you're going to be, if you're a male, you're going to be hypogonadal. You have less testosterone. The androgens actually improve insulin resistance. Cortisol, high levels of cortisol suppress the release of the adrenal androgen known as DHEA, which is also involved in improving insulin resistance. So really, over time, this chronic stress and inflammation gets you into a highly inflammatory obesity state. They call it diabesity, right? So eventually, you get into a diabetes type 2, and invariably, I think like 100% of the type 2 diabetics are obese. I don't know of a person with type 2 diabetes that is actually lean. You can get type 1 diabetes and be lean, but that's a whole different disease. Basically, the pancreas is getting destroyed. Ironically, also by fatty acids. Recent studies found out that the damage to the pancreas, so if you have untreated type 2 diabetes, eventually can progress into type 1 diabetes, which requires insulin, right? So you're no longer producing the high amounts of insulin seen in type 2 diabetes. You're no longer insulin resistant. You basically can destroy your pancreas if this level of free fatty acids in the blood gets to a point where they're actually starting to damage peripheral organs. Kidney damage in diabetes also recently was demonstrated to be due to the elevated levels of free fatty acids. Ironically, one of the drugs on the market that's used to treat the hyperlipidemia in blood and also the hyperglycemia in blood seen in type 2 diabetics is actually a derivative of vitamin B3, derivative of niacin, and the drug is called acipimox. If you look at that drug, basically what it does is suppresses lipolysis, which allows basically the proper oxidation of glucose, and over time, the increased metabolic rate allows you to process even the excess calories that you stored in your body as fat.
Wow.
Yeah, you look it up. It's spelled AC as in Charlie, I, P as in Paul, I, M as in Mary, O, X as in X-ray. Basically, not bastardized, but like a slightly modified version of vitamin B3, which the drug companies can now sell as a patented medicine and get a lot of money, even though you can take vitamin B3 yourself.
Yeah. So what is sugar's effect on cortisol if there's not a lot of fat in the diet?
It actually lowers it. And giving sugar, it's one of the standard protocols in lab animal experiments where they want to reduce the stress response of the animal. So if there, a lot of work revolves around, investigating the mental effects of chronic stress on animals. And it's known that chronic stress raises cortisol. There's nothing surprising there. One of the primary responses to stress, for us is to activate the adrenal, hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, which results in elevated levels of cortisol. Doctors know that elevated cortisol is bad for us when it's chronically elevated. So they're trying to figure out what can be done to actually mitigate that response to stress. And one of these established protocols, at least in animal research, is to give the animals water with quite a bit of sugar dissolved in it, not starch, not some other kind of sugar, but specifically sucrose. So sucrose sweetened water is basically like a staple in blunting the stress response, in lowering the excessive levels of cortisol. And also it happens to lower also the serotonin response and potentially even the estrogen response. All of these are stress mediators which are released when we're under stress. And there's a good reason for that. They're meant to basically, in an acute state, to kind of like turn off a lot of this machinery that we have that's considered luxurious in times of stress, which is high cognitive function, creativity, sexual function. All of these things are considered dispensable when we're under stress because we have to survive. So these stress mediators, cortisol being one, estrogen, serotonin, prolactin, a variety of the different interleukins, they're released to basically get us into a fight or flight response. But the idea is that in nature, there could be a life or death situation, but you either escape or you die, right? But it doesn't continue for a very long time. If it does, every single animal study done out there is unequivocal in regards to chronic stress kills. If you chase it, in fact, there's this very well known by some of the primitive cultures, and it's called as persistence hunting. So what happens basically is like only the humans, because of their high levels of fat stored, are actually meant to really expose themselves to stress for a prolonged time. And we can tolerate it better than most of the animals. You can actually hunt an antelope through exhaustion. Eventually you'll collapse and die simply because in nature, No animal is really meant to like stay in a stress state for, let's say, 20 minutes. It's either 1 minute you survive or you die, and that's about it. Then it's over, right? And then the stress mediators go down. Not so much in our modern lifestyle. We're constantly under stress, right? Cortisol is constantly, baseline cortisol is constantly elevated to the point where a good portion of the population are so-called non-responders of the dexamethasone suppression test. And it's really, this test is actually one of the tests for depression. When you go to a doctor's office and the doctor checks your cortisol, let's say it's slightly elevated. The doctor will probably ask to repeat that test, every couple of weeks. If it still comes back elevated, the doctor may send you to get the so-called dexamethasone suppression test. And what this really means is they inject you with a synthetic equivalent of cortisol called dexamethasone. And the proper response is when the body senses that you have an exogenous glucocorticoid administered to you, it's supposed to lower your own level of cortisol, right? Because the body says, I have something that works just as my cortisol. In fact, it's very, very strong. So I better not keep producing this cortisol because I'm going to destroy this organism. Now, when you're in chronic stress, in other words, when you're already starting to adapt to the stress, basically when they inject you with the dexamethasone, your levels of cortisol will not go down. It's one of the actually tests of depression. 80% of people with clinical depression are non-responders to the test. In other words, their cortisol levels stay elevated, which means there's some kind of adaptation that occurred. And the adaptation, one of the things that has been noticed in clinical research is that the number of glucocorticoid receptors goes down in the cell with chronic exposure to stress. That's just another way of the body regulating the effects of the stress, because if you're very sensitive to cortisol and the cortisol is chronically elevated, eventually the cortisol is going to shred your entire body and convert it to fuel. That's really the primary role of cortisol, is to keep the levels of blood glucose from falling too low. Because if they do fall too low, you can go into a coma and die. So really the primary role of cortisol is glucose regulation. Its secondary role is as an anti-inflammatory substance.
So if you're in that constantly, you're never going to be able to lose weight, right?
That's right. Correct. Yes. And this is probably the daily experience of the vast majority of people who are struggling with weight loss, with weight gain, because they're saying, I gained this weight. They know it was gained through stress. If you interrogate them and they ask them what happened over the last couple of years when the weight gain occurred, it's almost never they're telling you, oh, we ate too much. It's more like, I was eating irregularly, or I was eating less than my normal amounts, right? But I was very stressed at work. I had marital issues. I had some other kind of problems going on, medical issues maybe potentially, or family members. And over time, I gained weight. Well, of course you're going to gain the weight, because when the cortisol is elevated, it lowers your metabolic rate, and it actually blocks you from consuming even those calories, the reduced amount of calories that you consume. Perhaps the best example that I can give from humans is that there used to be the show on TV called The Biggest Loser. And basically they put these morbidly obese people through a really grueling schedule of both exercise, exhaustive exercise, and reduction of calories in order to get them to lose weight. And the ones that lose the most weight, they're called The Biggest Loser. And I thought, well, what a ironically apt name, because when you look at these people after they completed the actual competition, every single one of them not only regained the weight that they lost during the competition, they actually got even fatter on fewer calories. How is this possible? Only explanation, which has been since confirmed biochemically, is that their basal metabolic rate declined to by about 50%, by half, due to this stress that they put themselves through to reduce calories and additional stress. So I really think this is a recipe for disaster. You may temporarily lose weight if you're going through these grueling sort of like dieting fads and exhaustive exercises, which doctors love to recommend. But after that, you basically have to stay on this for life, or you will very quickly regain the weight and exceed it very easily, because now your body is basically saying, wow, I better turn off everything that is considered luxury, and I better learn to get by on a much lower amount of calories daily. And that's really the stress response in nature. It's usually due to starvation. The body says, well, there's not enough food, so I'm going to make you slow down. I'm going to turn off everything that you don't need except for survival, and I'm going to learn how to get by. Instead of 2,000 calories, I'm just mentioning that number because FDA says it all the time, to 1,000 calories a day, right? And then after in nature, after the famine, the fasting years, the lean years stop. Then you're supposed to get this period of abundance, right? And then you recover, and then maybe your metabolic rate rises. This has already been confirmed in hibernating bears. Hibernating bears gorge up on food. Basically, they get this mass of fat in them, but they actually, when you measure their insulin sensitivity, it's remarkably good while they're awake and eating, even though they're over consuming calories. Then they go hibernate, and basically by the end of the hibernation, when they measured their blood and measured their biomarkers, all these bears were diabetic while fasting, while not consuming anything. Yes, I'll send you the article. It's unequivocal. And when they wake up and they start eating again, specifically sweet foods, then their levels of free fatty acids in the blood decline because they're no longer stressed, they're no longer fasting, and then their diabetes resolves. So wild bears undergo a cycle of diabetes to health every year. Same thing can happen with humans if we could, basically, in the bear world, because the bear doesn't really have any natural predators, the main stressor is the winter and basically fasting, right? In our case, we fast ourselves to death almost, or at least to disease, but also we have the added factor of the social stress. So really, while this vicious cycle continues of under-consuming and overstressing ourselves, I don't really think there's any way out of it, with the exception of taking drugs that basically block the effects of cortisol. And one of the most famous drugs that is being used for that purpose, or was already demonstrated to lead to sustained, and I emphasize sustained, weight loss in morbidly obese people with Cushing syndrome. Cushing syndrome, the disease, caused by very high cortisol. And the fact that these people are so obese kind of tells you that it was cortisol that got them there. They don't need that many calories, but they balloon, and they have the characteristic central obesity, which is what doctors are very worried about. And when they see a person with, thin limbs and sort of like fat deposited around here, especially the midsection, saying, no, that's not good. You're at risk for cardiovascular disease. All of that is true. But for some reason, they're not making the parallel between the fact that this person looks like a person with Cushing syndrome. It's the exact same phenotype, exact same pathology underneath if you actually check their cortisol levels.
So basically, people who are fasting themselves to lose weight are really screwing themselves up in the long run.
For the long run, yes, absolutely. And actually, the worst thing you can do is fast and exercise. And an animal study demonstrated that if you do that, the baseline, there's an enzyme that produces cortisol, and the levels of this enzyme increase in the cell. So when you stop doing that's kind of normal, because if you're fasting and exercising, this means the body needs even more energy. And if you're not giving it through food, it's going to get it through your body. How does it get it? Through even higher cortisol. So the body says, well, if I'm continuously getting the signal from the environment that I have to basically perform on an empty stomach, I'm going to amp up cortisol, right? And unfortunately, when these animals were fasted and overtrained for, I think it was 8 weeks, I think the study was with both rats and mice. After they stopped this, their levels of cortisol did not decline. So these animals became ridiculously obese, even though the stress was no longer there, and they were consuming now even less calories, the exact same thing as the Biggest Loser. So what happened? Well, they gave him the anti-cortisol drug RU486, and things reverted back to normal. So in other words, if you gotten yourself into this predicament, chances are that at this point your obesity is now an endocrine disorder, and may need to be treated as such, because I don't think exercising and or dieting is going to do any more good. Multiple stories like that. It's not just mine. I actually experienced it myself. A lot of people that got themselves into the situation, once you get obese, then basically more stress and more dieting are actually going to make the situation worse.
So what do you think of the law of thermodynamics and calories in, calories out, whatever you want to call it? A lot of people call it calories in, calories out, or thermodynamics. Do you think it applies, or do you think you should kind of ignore it?
It does have, it's technically correct. Unfortunately, the macronutrients have different effects on the calories out part. So let's say if you're consuming more calories than you're expending, obviously you're going to be gaining weight. The problem is, the question is, okay, is a calorie in always contribute to the same amount of calorie out, all other things being equal? Fortunately, the question is no. In other words, if you're eating protein or if you're eating carbohydrates, they're more thermogenic than fats. In other words, they're going to raise your metabolic rate more. So even if you don't do anything else, eating more protein and carbs relative to fat is going to lead to either stable weight or at least much lower weight gain than if you're consuming much higher amounts of fat. Multiple studies have already confirmed this. I know there's the low carb diet community out there. I was part of it back in 2009. It helped for a little bit, but it turns out most of that weight loss was actually water. It wasn't fat. And as soon as you stop it, then you balloon to an even bigger proportions. And in my case, it was classic. My cortisol was high, my prolactin was high, etc. So until I actually found a way to really eliminate a good portion of the stress, and I was lucky to be able to do it because for many people it's not a choice. My situation did not improve. I mean, the doctor kept saying, "Oh, well, you need to exercise more." I said, "How much more?" I run 6 miles every day. Oh, maybe you're running too much. Well, you told me to run 6 miles a day. Well, then what else am I supposed to do? Well, maybe you need to eat less. I'm already eating 900 calories a day. I'm supposed to be eating 2,000. What else should I do? Well, I don't know what to tell you, Georgie. Maybe it's genetics. So as soon as you get to a point where the doctor cannot help you, it's just genetics or idiopathic. We don't know what's causing it. And they kind of wait for you to kind of start to decline even more. So for them to have a reason to send you to a specialist to investigate things more. And the doctor never thought that the fact that I had basically I had water retention, my face was puffy, my extremities were getting thinner, I had central obesity. It basically crossed the doctor's mind to say, well, maybe this is cortisol. I actually had to go and pay for my own labs through a direct-to-consumer lab to check these levels, and my cortisol came back 2 times higher than the upper range of normal. So I went back to the doctor and I showed him, and he said, "Oh, my God, that's Cushing's syndrome." So he sent me for an MRI. Nothing there, knock on wood, right? So he's like, well, maybe you're just genetically predisposed to have higher cortisol, in which case you're screwed because we don't know what to deal with you. You'll always be obese, you'll always be fat, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's it. They basically send you on the way home and saying, since cortisol is going to cause anxiety, if you want, you can come back. We'll give you anti-anxiety drugs. We'll give you antidepressant drugs because cortisol causes depression. It's now known. And that's it. They're basically managing your symptoms. What about the weight? What about the weight gain and everything else? Is like, that's your destiny, man. Sorry. That's how it is.
What about fatty liver? Do you think that sugar causes fatty liver?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the fatty liver is now known to be caused by excessive lipolysis. So there's always some lipolysis going on in the body. In other words, shedding of fat from the fatty tissue circulates around because at rest, your muscles prefer to oxidize fats, including your heart. During exertion, because the fat oxidation is a much slower process than carb oxidation, then the muscles during exertion switch to carbohydrates. But at rest, they actually prefer to burn fat, and that's why there is always at least a little bit of lipolysis going on. You're always burning fat while resting. So the best way to actually burn fat is to develop as big muscles as possible and be as unstressed as possible. Maybe bodybuilders exemplify this, probably the best possible way. They're some of the laziest people I know. Yeah. They strive to develop giant muscles, and basically they're usually not fat. But how do they achieve it? By taking anabolic steroids. But the anabolic word turned out to be a misnomer. Studies as early as the 1950s demonstrated all anabolic steroids are at their core anti-catabolic. What does that mean? They block the effects of cortisol. So that's how bodybuilders stay lean and build muscle, by blocking the effects of cortisol. Cortisol is really, when chronically elevated, is really the bane of your existence. Multiple studies with multiple animal models, including monkeys, demonstrated that you can reproduce all of the features of aging, every single one of them, not just diabetes and insulin resistance, by injecting higher than physiological amounts of cortisol into an organism. And that's exactly what we're doing to ourselves when we're chronically stressed and under eating.
So when somebody does add, my channel's about sugar. When somebody does add sugar back into the diet, are they going to start seeing themselves gain weight in the initial stages?
Unless they reduce the proportion, the basic calorically. Let's say if they're adding more sugar, they should be reducing proportionally the amount of fat they're consuming. But it shouldn't be affecting them that much because fat has 2 times more calories than sugar does. So let's say if you're adding 100 grams of sugar to your diet, that's basically 400 calories. 400 divided by 9. Let's say divided by 10 just to make it easier. So you should be cutting out about 40 grams of fat daily. That's not that difficult to do. You're not going to be, you will not become orthorexic simply by being slightly more mindful of your fat intake. Unfortunately, fat, because it's actually, especially polyunsaturated fat, because it's known to actually inhibit the satiety response. It's the favorite tool of the commercial food industry to keep you consuming and eating. They're going to put it in everything they can because no matter how much you eat, you'll never feel satiety and you're going to go for more. So try to avoid those foods because they're created very deliberately with the purpose of having you eat more and actually more fat than carbs or protein. Why? Because the cheapest component of if you look at the 3 macronutrients currently for the food industry to give you is the fats, because they're mostly getting from the agricultural industry, which is heavily subsidized by the government. It usually comes from either corn oil or soybean oil, both of which are probably the heaviest subsidized agricultural staples out there. Carbs and protein being the most expensive, carbs close second, and then fat is distant third. So of course, fat, especially the vegetable fats, are what you're going to find in every single commercial food out there because it's made with a obscene profit in mind.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Now, leptin and ghrelin, do you think that they play a huge role in this? Do you think they're affected by cortisol and sugar intake?
I know that leptin is actually, despite the bad rep that it gets into the I don't know, I guess mainstream press, leptin is actually known to improve insulin sensitivity, and there are several drugs that act like leptin that are currently in clinical trials for treating type 2 diabetes. Ghrelin is the hormone that gets released when we're starving. And ghrelin initially has some beneficial effects because it increases autophagy. Unfortunately, ghrelin and growth hormone go hand in hand. So if your ghrelin is chronically elevated, this means that basically you're going to, first of all, you're going to start producing more growth hormone. And second, ghrelin is also the signal for cortisol to get released. So ghrelin, as a acute signal, which kind of spurs you towards eating, is probably not a bad thing. But if this continues chronically, which is what the chronic fasters are going to experience, I don't think it's a good idea. And in fact, multiple studies demonstrated that chronically fasted organisms are at a much higher risk of cancers of the gastrointestinal tract, specifically pancreatic, liver, and stomach. As a sort of like an anecdotal story, Steve Jobs, who was known to chronically fast, acquired a cancer which was known to be not genetic. His father and mother are still alive. Nobody in the family had the cancer that he did. And basically the doctors thought that it may be due to a chronically elevated levels of ghrelin, which he got to because he fasted for days at a time. And then when he didn't fast, he was eating mostly a fruitarian diet. Ashton Kutcher, who played Steve Jobs into the movie, the biopic, I think it's called Jobs, actually ended up in the hospital with acute pancreatitis when he tried to implement the exact same feeding regimen as Steve Jobs. Just check it out. It was freaky. He basically said, you know what? I think Jobs did it to himself because he's like, he did it for 2 or 3 days just to get into the mood for the role, and he ended up in the hospital with acute pancreatitis. So yeah, I don't think ghrelin is something that you want to play with. And leptin, which it gets released when we actually when there's satiety, is actually something that's known to improve insulin resistance, despite the fact that most doctors view it as a bad biomarker.
All right. So the one thing that I heard you say a couple of times is the increase in sugar also increased the sexual function of animals and humans.
Yep.
If you could touch
and
on
fertility too. A couple of studies posted recently on my blog and on the forum where I usually post demonstrated, number one, that the prior study, which was with humans, these humans had type 2 diabetes. So they were infertility, especially male infertility, is one of the common symptoms of type 2 diabetes. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it leads to hypogonadism, functional hypogonadism, because there's nothing wrong with the glands, with the testicles. It's just that the high cortisol and high circulating fats are causing them are suppressing the production of the androgens. So these people were trying to beget children. The doctor told them they were infertile. And I don't know what made the researchers actually add a pound of candy a day to their diets. A pound of candy. That's ridiculous. Who eats 450 grams of sugar, pure sugar, added to the diet when you're already type 2 diabetic? Sacrilegious. But guess what? It drastically improved their fertility. And I think they went from like 0% conceptions to 72% in the active group, while in the control group, there were no pregnancies. And then a more recent study, just a couple of days ago, I posted it, done with animals, demonstrated that if you basically give animals free access to Pepsi or Coke, and I'm not advertising any of these brands, to drink freely, it increases the size of their gonads, doubles their testosterone, and increases the expression, the density of the androgen receptor inside of their gonads. So it makes them more androgenic, more male-like, and more fertile. What's not to like? Well, maybe a doctor wouldn't like it because he or she thinks that androgens will cause prostate cancer. They're the bane of every male's existence. They cause toxic male chauvinism. I don't think that any of that is true, at least from what we're seeing in animal studies and humans. You need, as a male, you need your androgens. They're actually very good for your health.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Asians, the Chinese, the Japanese, who mostly lived on rice, basically, like a diet of 90% of rice. Yeah, you see how they populate, and so it's clearly working for any any group of people who eat mostly carbohydrates has also a huge population. Like look at India, look at Asian countries, look at South America. Look, I just don't understand where some of this stuff comes from. A little bit about my background. If this is the first time you've seen this video, I was on keto for almost 10 years. My liver was shot. My kidneys are shot. I mean, I started smelling like ammonia. I went from 225 to 405. It was nuts. Yeah. And I actually last year from I think it was April to June, I did the experiment with myself. So I added a pound of sugar into my diet a day, and my testosterone doubled in a couple months.
There you go. And there's this tribe in the Amazonian called the Tsimane. They eat 90% carbs. It's mostly starch, but they eat 90% carbs. The rest of it is mostly protein and maybe 1 or 2% fat. So that all the cultures, as you mentioned, they eat very high carb, moderate protein, and low fat. They seem to be thriving. In fact, the Tsimane, I think they're the only tribe known to basically not have any cardiovascular disease in the actual tribe. This things like heart attacks or like calcification of the arteries or strokes or things or peripheral arterial disease. These things they don't exist there. Of course, some people say, well, there's a lot more to the Tsimane than their diet, right? But then we're seeing the same thing. Of course, they're living outside in the nature. They're not stressed. They don't live our lifestyle, right? But we're seeing in other cultures that do have our lifestyle, but still are eating very kind of like a high carb, moderate protein, low fat. The Asians, especially the Japanese, if you think of the Okinawan diet, they're basically eating mostly like lean fishes, rice, right? And kind of like low fat. I mean, fat is actually something difficult to come by in a sort of like in a self-subsistence community. It's not that easy to extract. So if you're going to extract it from plants, then you need some kind of a machinery. So really, the high-fat diets are kind of like the prerogative of either the industrial societies or cultures that live way up north, where basically all the animals that are around them, because they eat mostly meat-based diet, they have a lot of blubber because of the cold temperatures. Yep. But that's really the only cultures that naturally eat fat. Everybody else that you look at the natural lifestyle that actually naturally eats high carb, moderate protein, low fat diet, they have very low rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer, and their fertility is great.
Yeah, it's incredible. And as soon as, like, China's a good example of this, they adopted the Western diet, and now they have all the Western disease.
Diabetes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And actually, I think China now I think China has the worst rate of diabetes of any sort of so-called developed. I think at this point we could consider them a developed country. But if you look just like 20 years ago, most of the Chinese population was rural. Yes, it was very poor, right? And we keep getting told how poverty is like basically the mother of all disease and everything else. Yeah, they have disease, but they don't have cancer, the rates of cancer. They don't have the rates of cardiovascular disease. They don't have the rates of diabetes and obesity. India and China, as soon as they adopted the Western lifestyle, which is basically not only system towards more fat, but also towards the bad kind of fat, then basically they started seeing the exact same rate and curve that we've seen in the Western countries since the introduction of the seed oils in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Yeah, it's do you know who I have a hard time pronouncing his last name. I think it was a Danish doctor, Dr. Him Kinney. It was back in World War I. Have you heard of him? No,
I never read his work. I just don't necessarily remember the name.
Yeah, so basically, what happened was Germany was taking all of their cattle and meat and everything, for themselves, and all they really had left to eat was potatoes. And so they started eating his potatoes, and all of a sudden, even though they were in the middle of a war, all of their diseases went away. All of their stress, things thought of stress-related diseases. Heart attacks started going away. Cancer started going away. All the people were averaging losing like 50 to 80 pounds or something like that. I mean, and it was a forced study basically because they didn't have much other food, but they could grow potatoes, and all of everything went away.
And if you look, so actually the Soviet Union, I think, knew about these studies, and after the Second World War, actually experimented with the so-called potato diet. So if you go to Google to these days and type the potato diet, you will see several studies, some of them more recent because they confirmed it. It used to be called a commie science. They didn't trust it. But now the Western studies have also confirmed it. Yeah. You can not only survive, you can thrive on nothing but a diet of potatoes, butter, and salt. Not simply survive. You can thrive on that diet. And that diet will be basically mostly carbohydrates from the starch of the potatoes, a lot of keto acids in the potatoes, which get converted to protein. A lot of people say, well, where is the protein coming from? The keto acids in the potatoes get converted to protein while lowering your ammonia, right? So really, potato is like a gift from the gods. I consider it greater than beer.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, it's what they're sending up to Mars, right?
Yeah.
So do you think fruit or starch would be better for somebody wanting to lose weight loss or to lose weight?
Whatever interferes less with your digestion. I've come to realize that people have very different microbiomes, and for some people, eating fruit for some reason doesn't sit well with them. Could be like they're maybe lacking the enzyme to digest it. Could be the fruit that they're eating it's got some maybe pesticides on it. I don't know what it is, but I know people who thrive on starch, and I know people who thrive on fruit. And whenever they try to switch, maybe more towards fruit, because starch actually can have a pro-inflammatory effect. They claim that, the starch people say, I can't really tolerate fruit. So I've spoken to several Japanese people. They love their starch, right? You can try to give them fruit, and they would eat it, but, they're saying like, it just doesn't sit well with my stomach. Maybe their microbiome changes in a way that processes the starch very efficiently, and it doesn't cause the persorption into the bloodstream and the inflammatory and allergic reactions. So I would prefer fruit. Fruit sits better with me, but nothing gets me full and like sort of like this nice chummy feeling as like well cooked rice or well cooked potatoes. So I would get my comfort starch food maybe twice a week. The rest of the time I try to eat ripe fruit.
Okay, perfect. One thing that I asked people to ask me questions that they wanted to know: what is the effect on sugar with cancer? Do you think it causes cancer?
Absolutely not. That's actually one of the biggest misconceptions. And even medicine has now, well, unfortunately, this fat is still there, but even most of the oncologists that I know have given up on the idea that sugar causes or fuels the cancer, because in fact, they created a special molecule that looks like glucose. It's called 2-deoxyglucose. If you Google it, there's a Wikipedia page about it. And it's meant to basically trick the cancer cells into uptaking that molecule, but not the real glucose. So they're thinking that if you this is a way of depriving the cancer of glucose. So they think that if you deprive the cancer of glucose, the cancer is going to be starved and it's going to die and go away. It did not work. Multiple trials, including with humans, it did not work. So really, the reason the cancer, all this fad about sugar started is that they were looking at cancer cells, I think under a CAT scan, and they saw that they have a much higher uptake of glucose than normal cells. So they said, oh, cancer thrives on sugar. But what they also forgetting to take into account, or at least not telling you, is that while the cancer uptakes a lot more sugar than a regular cell, the cancer wastes most of that sugar into lactic acid. And the reason for that, as it turns out, is that the cancer cells are actually addicted to fat. So you can think of cancer cells as an extreme version of a diabetic cell. And now several studies have come out, including my own experiments, showing that if you administer substances that either limit the supply of fat or inhibit the oxidation of fat inside of the cancer cell, then the cancer cells can actually revert back to normal, or at the very least, stop growing. So it's not but if you restrict the sugar, what you're actually causing is, because the cancer cells do want their sugar, they're still living cells, they're going to start sending signals that will increase the production of cortisol, of adrenaline, of various inflammatory mediators, and this is what eventually causes cachexia. So if you check it out, if you go and Google and type lipolysis cancer, you'll see that lipolysis is elevated whenever you restrict sugar. You will see that lipolysis and inflammation, in other words, sugar restriction and inflammation, is what ultimately causes the wasting that invariably actually kills most of the cancer patients. I don't think many people know that, but most cancer patients do not die from their tumor, unless it's pressing on some kind of a very vital organ or it's in the brain. They die from the secondary effects, such as the cachexia, which is the wasting process, and or some of the side effects from the chemotherapy and radiation, which doctors are not shy to tell you that they actually kill. You have about 50% chance of surviving cancer treatment if it's a relatively aggressive cancer. So in vast majority of the cases, people do not die from their tumor. And another little secret that medicine doesn't want you to know about is that iatrogenic deaths, in other words, caused by doctors, are the third leading cause of death in the United States. In fact, actually in the entire Western world. Yeah, officially. Of course, nobody wants to talk about that because it means that the doctors are actively killing us. And if enough people knew about that, medical system collapse overnight, because it's 20% of the GDP. So you reduce that by even 5%, then that it's over. A lot of things will just go bankrupt overnight, and then it will be a domino effect from there.
Yeah, it's just like the banking. If something like 3% of people took all their money out of the bank, the thing would collapse overnight.
Over. Exactly.
Be a bank run. Yeah, it's crazy.
In fact, you don't have to get to the point of a bank run. As soon as the fear spreads that some bank could be like, under strain, right? Then the other banks will stop loaning to it, and then just the whole thing will start. That will cause the collapse.
Yeah. One thing that I myself and other people have noticed, once they start adding sugar or more carbs into their diet, they have a lot more triglycerides in their blood.
That usually means that the lipolysis is elevated, so the sugar is not getting processed properly, and the liver has no choice but to convert a lot of the sugar into triglycerides and store it. If you take things that limit lipolysis, such as niacinamide or aspirin, you can eat all the sugar you want, and your triglycerides will not move by an inch, by a single digit. And I recently posted a study showing that single dose of 300 milligrams of niacinamide dropped triglycerides by 75%.
Wow.
So it's not the sugar that you're eating. These people did not change their diets. It's something that's when you're adding sugar, and if it cannot get properly metabolized, then it's going to get converted to something else. So what's that thing that's preventing sugar from being metabolized? Fats. Where most of the fats coming from? Well, your diet and also a lot of lipolysis. Limit lipolysis, and you're going to take care of 75% of the problem.
Another thing that I hear a lot is people are always monitoring their blood sugar, and their blood sugar will spike really high after they eat like starch or fruit or something like that. Do you think that's dangerous, or do you think that's normal?
I don't think it's dangerous, and the doctors will tell you that the constant spiking of insulin is what eventually would cause the insulin resistance. That's complete bunk. It's just like we said, there are cultures out there that eat basically 80% starch, and because starch gets converted exclusively into glucose, it's very, very insulinogenic. These people are perfectly fine. Not only they don't have insulin resistance, they don't have obesity at all.
None.
So the idea is basically that the reason usually you get this insulin response from starch is, just like I said, it's converted to pure glucose. But if you're eating fruit sugar or sucrose, 50% of that is fructose. So you're going to get a lot less of an insulin response if really insulin is your concern. And when you actually challenge the doctor and say, okay, you're asking me to eat these resistant starches, but they all get converted ultimately to glucose. So how is this good for my insulin? What if you look at the tables, official tables published of the so-called glycemic index and glycemic load, sugar is right in the middle. At the very top are like white bread, right? Maybe potatoes, right? Rice, stuff like that. But even those are actually perfectly fine. So if we're eating something that's less insulinogenic, which is the fruit sugars and the white sugars, then what is already known to not cause insulin resistance, then I think we should be okay.
Do you think that processed carbohydrates are worse than, say, a potato? Do you think you'd be better off on Whole Foods, or do you think it matters if you have, sugar or, I don't know. You were talking about Pepsi and Coke before. Do you think it really matters?
So here's the thing. Well, that study with the obese type 2 diabetic people would added 1 pound of candy. I mean, I'm pretty sure that candy was about the highest level of processed sugar you can get. And their fertility improved, and they started having children. So if I could have my choice, I would try to eat if it's going to be processed sugar, it better be cane sugar, because the several studies found, and some studies have subsequently tried to debunk that, but there's still the question remains is what part, because most of the processed sugar is high fructose corn syrup. And that if it's in its pure form, in other words, fully processed, it should have the same composition of glucose and fructose as regular cane sugar. If in that case, I would actually not have a problem with consuming it. Unfortunately, several studies found that soft drinks sweetened with high fructose corn syrup contain a very large amount of starch, unprocessed starch, because most of high fructose corn syrup is produced from cornstarch. So the cornstarch is in there. It's adding to the calories, which are not listed on the label, about 200 to 300 more calories per can.
Wow,
that's can? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's not a small amount. And basically, you're getting these additional calories. They're all basically starch, so it means all glucose. And that might be one reason why people are seeing their insulin spike after a soft drink. And it has always baffled scientists, because they're saying we're not seeing that when we're giving people sucrose, because 50% is glucose, 50% is fructose. We should be seeing like if high fructose corn syrup is the same as sucrose, which is what the food industry keeps claiming, we should be seeing the exact same insulinogenic response. It is not. High fructose corn syrup is invariably higher. How much higher depends on how much unprocessed starch is in there. But the very fact that the starch is there gives me kind of like second thoughts. And if I could, I'll try to eat processed sugar that's in the form of cane sugar versus high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah, I tell people I worked in food distribution in the food industry for a lot of years, and those labels are they have a lot of leeway, you know.
Did you see the FDA rule and the USDA rule that has still not been revoked? So at the height of the pandemic, they basically told all the food vendors that the label is allowed to no longer be accurate.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? Yeah. So basically, so you can, because of course vendors would like to charge premium. And I used to eat this called keto mayo, which was made with coconut oil. So something's changed during the pandemic, and I noticed that this, usually if it's made with coconut oil and you leave it at room temperature, it actually has to solidify because coconut oil is usually solid at room temperature. Yeah. If you put it in the fridge, then it should become like a rock. Well, I noticed that after the pandemic started around May, June 2020, I buy these jars, and first they taste different, and second, when I put them in the fridge, they stay like very, very liquidy. So I immediately knew that the fat has been replaced with something else, most likely some kind of a polyunsaturated fat. And when I actually emailed the vendor, they responded back with that statement from the FDA and USDA saying, hey, we no longer claim anything that's on the label. The label is there. And I said, okay, so what part of the label is true? No comment.
It's nuts. And I worked in that industry even back in the 90s and stuff. And some of the stuff, I mean, we just, especially, if there's oils used to process things, you don't have to put that if it's not actually in the food, they don't even put it on the label. So you might be eating a ton of fat and not even know it, especially with breads and, because it's hard to make bread without oil coating what it's on. And there's a lot of things that don't go on that label.
Yeah, if it's under like a certain amount per serving, then you also don't have to report it, right? There's like all kinds of ways to like go around and produce a label that looks perfectly healthy, but basically adds up. If each serving has this stuff that's not reported on it over the course of a full meal, you can get a lot of extra calories of the bad kind, meaning like, not good for your health, and you won't even know about it. And there's perfectly legal not to report it.
Yeah, it's this industry. And the last question that I had from viewers is, does excess fiber keep you fat? I thought that was kind of not true, but what are your thoughts on fiber? I think a lot of this is coming from that book, Fiber Fueled.
It depends on the fiber. So I know the doctors are promoting soluble fiber because soluble fiber can bind cholesterol. And it's known that if you're consuming a lot of soluble fiber, your cholesterol will actually go down. So doctors are obsessed with your cholesterol levels, right? But what they're not telling you is that soluble fiber, just like starch, can actually persorb, in other words, absorb through the intestine undigested. And then whenever it gets into your bloodstream, any foreign particle sufficiently large to get recognized by the immune system, it will trigger first an allergic reaction, which of course triggers the release of histamine. And histamine is a highly pro-inflammatory molecule. And over time, if histamine keeps getting released, if you keep eating that, that fiber all the time, then eventually gets this chronic inflammatory reaction, which is really not good for you. Chronic low-grade inflammation is now officially recognized as a cause, if not the cause, of most of the chronic degenerative disease that we're seeing in the Western populations. So the soluble fiber is actually also, it's a food for the bacteria in your gut. Now, some people say, well, you got to feed your microbiome. Actually, very long time ago, it was discovered that animals that had their guts kept mostly clean, in other words, sterile, free of bacteria, have about 40% longer lifespan than the animals that have some kind of a bacterial colonization. Now, of course, us living among bacteria all the time and eating these foods is probably not a realistic thing to keep the gut completely clean. But if that is the case, then we should be giving as little food as possible to the bacteria there. Because whenever we feed the bacteria in the microbiome, their turnover rate increases. In other words, the old bacteria dies and new bacteria gets generated. And when the old bacteria dies, there's something called a gram-negative type bacteria. And when the bacteria dies, it ruptures. And in the outer wall of the bacteria, there's this molecule called endotoxin, which is very highly inflammatory. So it's a very good way to increase inflammation is to eat soluble fiber and increase inflammation through two pathways. Number one, it gets directly absorbed into your bloodstream undigested. Number two, it feeds the bacteria, which produces endotoxin. It's the insoluble fiber, which is really good for you, because it actually has an antibacterial effect and stimulates the colonic motility. So you're going to basically have an decreased bowel transit time, which means you're going to go to the bathroom more often. And the more often you go to the bathroom, basically the less opportunity do you have to reabsorb some of the toxins that are generated in the intestine during the processing of the food. So insoluble fiber is great. In fact, It's one of the reasons chimpanzees is thought they don't suffer even though they have like 99% the same genome as us. One of the reasons they don't suffer from these diseases that we do, even when they get transferred to the zoo, is if they keep their original diet, which is very high in insoluble fiber. If they try to move them to our diet, which basically feeds the bacteria into the colon, they start getting the exact same gastrointestinal cancers that we do in a very early age as well. So the insoluble fiber, very good. Soluble fiber, not so good. And even the cholesterol lowering effect is actually now known. Several studies looked at, okay, we know soluble fiber lowers cholesterol. Does this translate into better outcomes for cardiovascular disease? The answer now is no. So yes, maybe you lower cholesterol, but it's not going to help your overall health.
So basically adding greens into your diet might help you out quite a bit because they're
yes.
not okay.
Greens, but I would actually try to cook them first. So let's say cooked kale is probably very good for you. It's got like a lot of vitamin K. It's got a lot of calcium, which can only be absorbed if the kale is cooked. And it's got a lot of magnesium also because it's a component of chlorophyll. But it's also not really absorbable unless you cook the green first. And it's got a lot of insoluble fiber, which is accessible whether you eat it raw or not. But when you're eating it raw, most of the greens have this defense mechanism to inhibit your digestion because that's how they protect themselves from the herbivores, right? And we're not herbivores. The herbivores, of course, counter-developed, evolved this tricamera stomach that they keep processing this food for like 24 hours. They regurgitate, they dissolve again. We don't do that, right? So if we're gonna be eating the greens, make sure they're cooked because it's much healthier for us, much more absorbable. We can actually get a benefit of a lot of the nutrients that are out there that are in the greens.
Perfect. I think that's all my questions. Did you have anything that you wanted to tell the viewers?
Yes, if you're struggling with losing weight, especially if you've gained weight on, let's say, a low carb diet, or like you're exercising and you're fasting and you keep getting the weight, or you find out that you're starting to gain weight on a lower calorie diet, please ask your doctor to run a hormonal profile. More often than not, both you and the doctor will be surprised. And usually if the doctor sees an abnormality in the hormonal profile, he or she will send you to an endocrinologist. And as clueless as they are, they will try to treat the actual hormonal abnormality, because until that gets addressed, no amount of dieting and exercise will actually help. In fact, it will probably make things worse.
Oh, so if somebody's trying to lose weight, do you think cutting exercise out would be more beneficial?
Yeah, replacing it with concentric exercise. And to a lot of people, that means lifting weights. Unfortunately, weights have both a concentric, which means contracting with a load, and eccentric, unfortunately, means relaxing with a load. The eccentric portion is very damaging to the muscles, and it's what used by bodybuilders because it leads to hypertrophy. When you damage a lot of the tissue, then the body overcompensates by creating more. But what you want really is the concentric portion, because that's the portion that increases the number of mitochondria in your cells. That's what raises your metabolic rate. So what does that mean? Climbing stairs, because you're kind of like contracting with a weight. You're exerting yourself with a weight, but then on the way down, I don't know, maybe like take the bike down. Or like my favorite is I climb the stairs on a very high-rise building, then I take the elevator down. Then I climb the stairs, take the elevator down. That's one thing. Biking is actually mostly concentric because you're only exerting when you're pressing on the pedals. When you're actually relaxing the foot, right? When it's off the pedal, there is no load there, right? Swimming is probably another fairly concentric kind of exercise. So, but no running. I mean, I should say no running, but like try to limit the part where you basically like, first of all, you're going to exhaustion. In other words, you're starting to pant, you're starting to catch your breath. Number two, try to also limit exercise that generate a lot of lactic acid in your muscles, because that's a sign you're overexerting yourself. And lactic acid is another signal for the body to lower the metabolic rate. Why? Because the body says, well, you're under stress. If I keep the metabolic rate high and you're also burning additional calories for stress, then I'm going to really like shrink you down. Well, I don't want that. So it's going to lower your metabolic rate commensurably to the amount of exertion you're causing yourself. It's better to be the other way around. And a study already showed that people who are naturally lean are lean because of high metabolic rate, and that leanness translates to health. People who are forcefully lean, if I could call it that way, are actually not healthy regardless of how lean they are.
That's probably the people you see drop dead at 39 of a heart attack.
Yeah.
Perfect. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions. Would you want to do a part 2 of this at some point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just let's see what the feedback on this is, and let me know, and we can schedule another one.
Perfect. Thanks for
Awesome.
coming on, Georgie. Do you want me to link your website and everything down below?
You can mention the blog, which is I usually post under the moniker alias Haidut, HAIDUT. So I have a blog which is haidut.me, and that's pretty much it. If people, I just post there like semi-regularly, so people can read. People, I post those studies that I find online, and most of these are in on the metabolic topic, basically how to get healthy by increasing metabolism.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's answered a lot of questions. Thanks so much for being on here.
Appreciate it.
Peace.
Thank you.